Soy un poderoso que tengo, por supuesto, influencia en muchas cosas.
Esta no es la fiesta tuya, te equivocaste. No, es la fiesta de Pinochet.
Radio La Central y el grupo de estudios discretos Paul Feyerabend presentan Vitrina Distópica, la realidad no es capitalista.
Mordiendo el siniestro funeral del mundo.
Somos millones y llamamos a todos nuestros hermanos a que se suman a este.
Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenides. This is the first emission of Vitrina Dystópica that we are going to do in a different language other than Spanish. And this is a very special moment because we have very special guests. So first of all, I want to thank you, Erin, Manning, and Brian Massumi for having me here at your place in Montreal. To start, I will like to ask you if you can introduce yourself for our Chilean audience.
So I'm going to introduce Brian, and then Brian will introduce me.
Perfect.
You're always springing things on me.
So Brian Massumi is the best person I know to think with. We tend to read each other's work out loud, and we've really shared a voice, I think, for these 20 and a bit years. We work together, and Brian goes between doing a lot of writing to doing a lot of shoveling and thinking about solar panels for our 3 Ecologies project. Brian is retired, which is completely unfair. And when he's not writing, he's playing with the cats.
Well, Erin is someone who's intensely involved with thinking and with engaging with other people all the time, and finding new ways of doing that and bringing concepts and action together on a day-to-day basis, in the house, outside the house, in the university, outside the university, and that creates an environment that we both think within and write within. And she writes on philosophy. She's also an artist. I'm not sure what else.
She eats mangoes.
She eats lots of mangoes, yes.
I would like to start with a coincidence, actually, because I really love coincidence. And right now in Chile, and not only in Chile, I mean in Spanish, in countries, your work is finally being translated into this language in a more systematic way than before. Brian's What Animals Teach Us About Politics was published in Spanish in October 24, 10 years after its original release. And Erin's The Minor Gesture is set to appear in 2025, 9 years after its first edition, both through Cactus Publisher and collaborators. So I'm wondering if you think that this timing reflects some kind of internal shift, realignment, or different inclination within the political and conceptual landscape. And of course, if you could briefly speak about the books, that would be amazing.
I don't know if I know enough about the Latin American context to actually give a good answer, but it seemed to me that the framing of problems opened up in the last 5 years or so, at least, from what was maybe a more recognizably Marxist cultural theory and Marxist political theory approach to one that's maybe open to other forms of Marxism, such as autonomist thought, and perhaps toward issues of self-organization that might have more of an anarchist-oriented bent, but in the context of climate change and environmental issues and issues about the relations between the state and nature and legal status for natural entities, things like that. Seems to me that there's been a bit of a paradigm shift, but again, that's speaking completely from the outside, because I haven't really had sustained contact with Latin America. I've come in and out, but I don't really know the domain that well. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
Yeah. I think I'll say a few words and then maybe you describe a little bit about what Animals Teach Us About Politics is doing, you know. But there's something to be thought with. I'm in the same position as Brian. I don't really know the context, but I do know some things. In 20 years, a little bit more than 20 years of collaborating around Science Lab and then 3E, the majority of our collaborators have come from Latin America, from Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, from Australia, from Europe, but not from the US. We've had very few collaborators from the US, actually, over those years. And I mention that because there's a dominance in the English-speaking world. French is my mother tongue, so you know I don't mean necessarily the natively English-speaking world, but there's a dominance in the English-speaking world of English-speaking literature. It's very rare that Anglophones read literature in another language, even in translation. There's a real sense that everything that needs to be thought is already there. And it's a American-centric way of thinking. So it's not, it's really the sort of centrality of the United States makes this possible, and Canada lives on the edge of it. I mean, Brian and I have published almost all of our work in the United States. But we're not those people who only read English-speaking language books. We're very influenced by other languages, but we don't know, I don't think either one of us really, the literature in Spanish. I think we know the literatures in French better, you know, some other literatures that come to us, you know, and it's not necessarily a block in the language, we both understand Spanish, but it has to do with how movements of thought move. So I think that I can't say why now. I mean, part of it, at least for mine, it's been a lot of years in the making. Part of it, I think they contacted me, Cactus, maybe 5 or 6 years ago already, and they talked to me also about Always More Than One, but it's like funding, where to get money, how to get rights, how to get translators, and so on. But my feeling is that, for me at least, what's really, really exciting about this is that once a book begins to circulate in another language, other books in that language begin to circulate back to me. And it puts me then in an active conversation that I was yearning to be in to begin with. And then the other thing I want to say, and it's going to sound very pessimistic, but I'm feeling, as you know, very pessimistic about the US today because of the administration and the violence and the fascism of the administration, is that our editor at Duke University Press, where Brian and I have a book series and have both published, sent us an email this week. We had some questions for him about how dire the publishing world is in the US. And it's really remarkable how much the sales have dropped since COVID and how few people are buying books. And one of the responses to this in his email was that it was necessary, in what I felt was a more pointed way than had been the case before, to publish work that was going to sell. And I think that, and this took me aback. I'm going to come back to the question of Chile, or of Spanish speakers, but this took me aback because it's always been my feeling that thought doesn't necessarily do its work in the time in which it is said. You know, a lot of the thinkers that moved me deeply were lost in the time in which they spoke. And it's always felt to me that in order to do the work of thinking beyond where you can think, you have to not want to be understood in the time in which you write. You have to be okay with possibly not meeting the thought processes of that time. I mean, to some degree at least. And so in thinking about that, you know, having that on my mind, I then read an article about another American press that Brian has been involved with, Autono Media, Jim Fleming in New York, who has been publishing for now, I think, like over 40 years. And he said he never once made money. And I was thinking about these tensions, about what it is to have a project and to make thought your project, and then to build a world to make it possible to make thought your project. So you find other ways to make your money and you make thought your project. And it feels to me, maybe I'm idealizing, but it feels to me that this has been a necessity in Latin America, where there wasn't the money. Like, so that you weren't like publishing books because you're going to get rich from them, but because they needed to be in the world. And in that way, it feels like an enormous gift to be translated and then to be in that conversation where something is really urgently happening, as opposed to falling into the trap of thinking I have to write a book that is now going to be saleable. You know, I have to be in that environment, because that's not, I think, what either one of us are interested in doing. We're interested in trying to put our thought into a place where we can grow as thinkers.
Yeah, one thing I noticed, going back to Latin America intermittently over the years, is that there used to be a real rejection of, at least in the forums that I was presenting in, a rejection of notions of micropolitics or affirmative politics, and that seems to have changed a lot. And maybe that created a bit of an opening for the reception of a book like What Animals Teach Us About Politics, which is in a lot of ways about what I call primary resistance, which is a kind of affirmative effervescence that moves in creative directions, that passes through the individual rather than being directed by the individual, and that catches the individual in its current. And I wanted to look at animal play and concepts of instinct, and to actually argue that that kind of creative margin of play is built into instinct, and that suggests a lot of readjustments in the way we think about politics, that we don't have to make dichotomies between the acquired and the genetic or the innate, or simply bracket the innate, because when you do that you fall right back into a nature-culture dichotomy. But if you want to talk in terms of a nature-culture continuum, it's obvious that instinct is a factor in all animal and plant life, and you have to grapple with that. And so I looked toward animal play rather than toward sexual display, to look at the beginnings of animal culture and also prefigurations of language, because in the past, coming out of a post or neo-Darwinian framework, in a lot of feminist thought in particular, people looked at sexual display, and which obviously has a very, very important part in animal expression and animal culture, but it also puts the creativity back on the foundation of a biological function in the service of reproduction. And I wanted to see, even through those kinds of functions, that there was a sort of a creative play happening that was in excess over the functions, even if they were also fulfilling certain functions.
Yeah, there's a lot of resonance with the minor gesture. They're different. Brian and I are always thinking through something very similar, but we approach it from different places, I think. And I think we influence each other's thinking a lot at a sort of deep ethical place. And The Minor Gesture is a book that ultimately wants to think what Nietzsche would call an affirmative politics. And affirmative politics, affirmation in Nietzsche is always tragic. So affirmation has nothing to do with optimism or hope or ease. It has to do with the speculative pragmatism of the conditions for life themselves, and how to be equal to those conditions, how to create techniques that are equal to those conditions without putting the human at the center of them. So it's not a humanist project. It's a project that is interested in being attuned to how those conditions might craft themselves, and how to be able to address that outside of the figure of ressentiment, which would only ever be capable of a kind of nostalgic return to the wish for the kind of whiteness that allowed colonialism to be, a dominant paradigm, for example. So the book is a book that I came to. I wrote what I ended up thinking was a trilogy, though I didn't write it that way on purpose, a trilogy on movement, so politics of touch, relationscapes, always more than one, that led me to the concept of the minor gesture, which has been an exciting place to land, because I don't feel like I fully know what a minor gesture is. And it feels like since I put the minor gesture in the world, it's become a bit of a collaborative project to think through what minor gestures are in the techniques that they engender. So that it isn't a concept that you can define so much. It's more a modality that you can become attuned to, that shifts the orientation of where you might situate the political. And in that sense is very similar to the creativity that Brian talks about in relation to that kind of prism of instinct and creativity in the animal, and the excesses that it makes operative.
There's a phrase that Erin uses often in her books that I think is really useful to gloss the concept of affirmation, because affirmation isn't saying yes to what is. It's not consent on the part of an individual to what is happening in the world. It's not a subjective act in that sense. And what she says is that affirmation isn't consenting to what is, it's asking the question, what else? And that connects it to the event. And events are always, Nietzsche said, they strike like fate. The conditions change. You have no volition in the eventful changings of condition. You're taken up in them. You can act within them with volition, but that really consists of what Erin's calling a minor gesture, because it gives you a power to modulate or inflect or tweak, not to direct from above. There is no position from above from which to direct or to say yes. So affirmation is taking full stock of the event, affectively feeling its intensities, and then drawing on the resources in your body, in your life, asking, what else could there be? What can I draw out of this set of constraints that converts them into a set of affordances for creative action? So affirmation is creative, and it's definitely, it's completely bound up with notions of event rather than notions of subjectivity and subjective consent.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this question, what else, is something that really resonates with Chilean recent events, for instance. And I think this mix that we can find in your books between this kind of autonomy heritage in this difference with the more like with other Marxist tradition, but at the same time this mix with process philosophy is something that is actually getting more attention in countries like Chile, at least. I think because of this political event that we had in 2019, for instance, but the resolution of this was really like sad in a certain way, but make us to rethink and to pose new questions and new ways to ask these questions. I would like to, if you can just deepen a little bit in the relation with this the autonomy heritage and the mix with process philosophy, if you can.
Yeah. Well, for me, the connection to the autonomist tradition is that there's always a thinking on the ground level of the changing conditions and the changing recompositions of capital. The autonomous tradition was very successful at creating a kind of collective study where they were able to help each other perceive the changes and create responses to it, rather than operating according to a set of presuppositions that were too unchangeable to adapt, or a program given in advance. Then there's a whole questioning of the nature of the political subject, and in particular the subject of resistance. So it opened up, from a class perspective, to all kinds of struggles around expression, creativity, and subjectivity. And it opened up in a way that notions that came later, for example, in Negri and Hart, like the common, I think shifted the ideas of what the collectivity looked like. So rather than being based on identity, being based on resemblance between individuals, it was based on a kind of sort of a kind of internal diversity and ferment, where the characteristics of the collectivity weren't given in advance, but were constantly in mutation and creating themselves. So it created a kind of notion of a political subject that was always in excess over its prior categories, and moving into that sort of area of gesturing itself differently into existence as it's becoming. And that shifts the terrain from, it doesn't shy away from frontal resistance against macro powers like the state, but it does surround those by a vast terrain of creative activities where individuals and groups are affirming their coming together and their being together and their becoming together differently, in a way that is drawing on intensities of everyday experience that are what make life worth living and can prefigure coming political forms. So for me, it's a kind of politics to come that comes at the center of it, rather than a program that people are working from.
Yeah. I come from a slightly different place in this conversation, because I wasn't so aware of autonomy, and those are not the strands that turned me into a thinker. They've affected me later. I came into my thinking as a philosopher, and also as a dancer, and came slowly, I think, to a critique of capital. So my approach, I think, was slightly different. I entered into the question of what is a body, and because it felt to me so vital to think about movement, to rethink the political. I was very aware that the political and the modern subject had been produced in an environment outside of movement, but without movement, that it was very important for the body to be stable. And I became very, very interested in the stability of the body. The body politic is not a moving body, and began to think that through. As I began to think that through, it led me to the places that Brian is talking about, because that's where you end up going, but it took me a while to get there. And I am a writer who works their thinking through, so you can really see what I'm learning reading book by book. And that led me to ask systemic questions that became in my work systemic questions around race, around neurodiversity. And process philosophy has become, for me, it's not so much a philosophy I work with as a way of life. I need to have I need to be able to be in a movement of thought that takes process as the driver. In order to think movement, there's no other way to think movement. You know, if you don't want to begin with the subject, which is not a good way to think movement, then you have to be able to begin with process. And when you begin with process, ultimately down the road you can't get outside of the question of where else process does its work, and the economy is one of those places where it does its work. But it just took me time to get to that question. And I think today, you know, a lot of what I try to think about is, you know, how systemic operations like whiteness, for example, or neurotypicality operate a certain kind of partition that acts as though you could separate out these different arenas. And I try to show how they cannot be separated out. You know, you can't think the production of subjectivity without the production of with financial modes of production, for example. It's impossible. Or you can't think the speculative without the speculative economy. But you have to be careful to not sort of push these two into one, you know, mimicry of itself. They're certainly not always doing the same thing, but you have to be able to think them systemically through and with one another. And I think process thought just really allows that to happen.
Yeah, I think I came very young to anarchist thinking, and what anarchist thinking brought to me was a posture of the need to ferret out and oppose domination in whatever forms it takes, even within movements. It brings up the question of microfascism in the ways that structures of domination live within us and are repeated often in alternative political formations and alternative communities. I was coming from a collectivist anarchist perspective. What autonomy also gave me was a way of thinking that collectivity as a collective individuation. They weren't using that term, but I think that the way the production of subjectivity happened in a kind of synergy between individuals on a global level, dovetailed with notions like Simondon's notions of collective individuation that Deleuze and Guattari took up in their ideas about collective assemblages.
Building on this, and just for finish the first block, how do you think that we in Chile and abroad, I mean, we might rethink the links between everyday politics and practices on one side? You were saying something about this, but I want to just go a little bit deep. And the macro issues we're facing on the other. I mean, it's like living through a fascist era within the context of a mass extinction. I think this is pretty important right now. It's a hard question, I know, but
Can we talk about a bigger problem?
just a glass.
Well, I think maybe continuing what I was saying before, I think what that idea of collective individuation brings is a notion of another phrase that Erin uses a lot and that we use together when we speak and write, which is the concept of emergent collectivity. And rather than representing an existing constituency, I think a movement has to represent the future that it's becoming into, that has to be on that edge of emergence and operating actually beyond what it is and where it is at the moment. And Erin also often talks about that as a movement of outdoing oneself, or the movement of outdoing itself. That's very, in a lot of ways, built into the book about animals in terms of the kinds of excess, what I call surplus values of life, that are produced through relation, and particularly relation in a creative movement where bodies or bodies in the environment are in kind of constitutive relationship to one another, that creates an opening for something new to start to emerge. So I think the projects that we do on the ground have to do with creating the conditions for emergent collectivity. And it's the creating the conditions part that's important, because you can't create emergent collectivity. If you try to, you're pre-directing it, you're pre-defining it. You have to set in place techniques, what we call enabling constraints, for something to catalyze. It has to self-catalyze, it has to self-organize. And when it does, there's a kind of feeling of an intensity of life involving itself in its own process to continue along different lines. So we've spent the 20 years we've been working on projects together. It's all been around how to do that, and how to do that in the context of a practice of event creation, event organizing. So I think that we have that's a really important complement, but not substitute, for the fight on the macro political level. Because that is a kind of creative terrain where you're already operating in an anti-fascist way. In a way, hopefully, if you're doing that properly, you're making it impossible for the microfascisms that are in us all to express themselves as often or as strongly. And you're creating a base from which people can fight the macro battles with a sense of solidarity and a sense of mutual aid.
Yeah, there's so many ways to come into this question. One of the ways would be to say that I have just the most extraordinary luck to be living every day with a person who wants to learn. And when you live every day with a person who wants to learn, then you're in the practice of learning no matter what you're doing. Whether you're writing, whether you're, trying to figure out how to use an Excel sheet, as Brian's been doing all week this week to try to do the numbers for a nonprofit. But
I don't write about quantity and quality for now.
But it's a painful question, because it is ultimately the question that always comes, right? You do this work in process, and then people say, well, what about the real world? Which is not your question, but it is the question, right?
Yeah.
And the real world today feels really scary. Like today, this Sunday, yesterday, Trump was clear that he was imposing 25% tariffs on Canada, which is enormous. We're a very small country, a very large territory in a very small country.
And that's in the explicit context of wielding what he called economic force to annex Canada to the United States.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say. So I'm Canadian. I've grown up in a country that had the great privilege of imagining itself outside of those geopolitical terrors. It's one of the very few countries in the world that could say that about itself. When we would talk to somebody being invaded, we'd say, well, that's of course nothing we could ever experience here. And we are experiencing it. I think in a at least at the level of fear, there's a sense of, oh my goodness, there's an invasion happening. And in the moment, and I think, being Canadian is it's a very weird world to live in, because we can't vote in the US, but we are affected by everything that happens there. And so my US friends, and Brian is an American citizen as well as a Canadian citizen, though he doesn't like to admit it, are in shock. I think really in shock. I think that we could have all kinds of rhetoric about what we were expecting, but nobody could imagine this. Because you can never imagine when a world shifts.
Even though they said outright that that document from the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, almost everything he's done in the first week is straight out of that playbook.
Yeah. So the macro question feels urgent, but I think it is equally urgent not to give in to it. Because the macro is a modality of the grand gesture. It's a belief system. The problem with it as a belief system, I'm not saying it doesn't have effects, it has enormous effects, but the problem with it as a belief system is that it doesn't operate in any of the ways that Brian described. There's no emergent collectivity at that level. There's a set of conditions, but they've hardened. And to fight against that hardening, it's hopeless. You have to then adopt its logic. And as soon as you've adopted its logic, well, you're in it in a way that you can't fight it. Right? And I think this has always been the challenge. Yeah. Right? And so then when people say, well, you're not dealing with the macro, therefore you're not really doing the political work because it's just small gestures, blah, blah, blah. But the minor isn't small. Right? The minor is another logic altogether. It's not an easy logic because you have to be adept at more than one level of rhythm and speed. Right? So what I want to say, and I know this is going to sound a bit naive, but I don't think it's naive. I hope it's not naive, is that saying that Brian is a curious person and I live with that curiosity is actually what we need. That there's really no moment in our lives when I can separate practice and philosophy. Never. You know, Brian has recently written an extraordinary book called The Personality of Power that I feel is a logic for the times to come. I don't separate that logic. I don't cut it away from myself when I go and work in the greenhouse. It's always with me that we have to practice logics. But the practicing of logics has to be done in every modality. And that's, I think, what we need to teach each other over and over and over again. So I'm going to give an example that I gave someone recently, and it's a bit of a silly example, but it stayed in my head. And it has to do with people who have been fighting this fight. So white people have not been fighting, like white Canadians like me have not been fighting this fight. We've had the privilege of believing that we didn't have this fight to fight. But people, black people, people with the history of slavery, indigenous people, they have been fighting this fight. And they have been making a life. Palestinians, they've been fighting this fight, right? Like they're walking down the beach all the way to northern Palestine where there are no houses. Like they know how to live in the everyday. I don't know how they do it, but they do it because there's no other everyday to walk into, right? Presumably. And in the everyday, they teach us, I think, that the techniques are there. Like one of the biggest mistakes we make in the world is to think we have to create them anew. We don't have to create them anew. They're there. We just have to create the conditions for us to be able to be in the creativity of them, with them, so that we can be moved by them and move them, you know? So an example that came to me some time ago was this idea of a mother, a single mom. And, you know, she's black, and she's going to her third job of the day, and she's putting milk in the fridge so that there's milk when the kids get up in the morning. And the kids won't know that the milk in the fridge is the important thing, but it is the important thing, because when they get up, the milk, they're gonna be able to have breakfast. And nobody is going to give her like a gold medal for having put the milk in the fridge, and nobody is going to say she staged a revolution because she put the milk in the fridge, but she did actually, because she created the conditions for those kids to be able to think, you know? And she didn't ask the world to be, you know, putting her up on a pedestal. And this has been happening forever. You know, this is where I try to think, and it's very, very important to me to think there at the level of the philosophy as well, like to not become anti-intellectual and to not say, oh, it's more important to put the milk in the fridge than to write a book. No, not at all. Because the putting the milk in the fridge is also what allows the book to be written. And that's the connection we seem to always lose when we start talking about the macro, as though those minor gestures that shift the conditions of existence had to be swept away in order to now descend at the macro level, where we know that when that happens, we just replay the same tape. I mean, the same power grab happens over and over and over again.
Can I say something, or is it going too long?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's at a certain point in the Sense Lab, the group that Erin started, that we worked in for many years, that has now morphed into something we call the 3 Ecologies Project. We spent a couple of years talking about burnout and working with other groups about burnout, and people in doing activist work confront that problem all the time. I think there's almost a kind of anticipatory burnout because of the enormity of the problems facing us. Just thinking about issues like climate change and the rise of fascism across the world is enough to burn you out without before you open the front door in the morning. And it sort of goes back to ideas of affirmation. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that affirmation has to do with optimism for the future, or when you talk about the creative aspects of affect, like I do continually in my work, that it makes you an optimist. There is no possibility of optimism in this world. That's why we need affirmation, because we still have to live in the world. We still have to get up and open the door in the morning. And the intensity of thinking, imbuing everyday life, makes your everyday actions in your environment larger than they are, because it's putting you on that verge where you're constantly moving toward maybe another way of formulating something, or a way of thinking might inflect the way you're moving. Things have a little bit more flexibility, and a little bit more of a margin of play in them. And if we can create environments for each other on the everyday level, then we're giving each other the gift of being able to continue. And we need each other for that. It's not something that you can do individually.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think that is really important to us in Chile, because during the 2019 revolt, we faced this moment when macropolitics capture the energy of micropolitics, and I know this is not something about the size of the thing. I mean, yeah, it's logics, and we actually, after this, we try to think about temporality, and the temporality that macro try to install upon the micropolitics logics. And this is something really important. Create these spaces in order to have another kind of temporality that allows us for confronting the kind of issues that we have. And I have to make a break right now, and we're gonna ask you for a song to put in the podcast. And now we are just going to listen to that song and then come back. So, estamos nuevamente with Brian Massumi and Erin Manning in the second half of our very special episode of Vitrina Dystópica. I'm going to introduce a new question. Probably is deeply linked with we were talking in the previous section. But when we read your work, both of you beautiful work across different modes of existence, cognition, valuation, and attention. Today in Chile and everywhere, I think, there is a widespread distress over how our attentional and affective capacities seem to be eroded by contemporary communication technologies, which are actually extraction machines. Yet this concern rarely translates into meaningful action. It feels like a kind of a tragedy, akin to how we experience the climate crisis or this kind of climate crime. Do you think that this paradoxical relation is symptomatic of our current affective and political condition, that we can actually acknowledge the deeper or the huge difficult situation with our attention capacities or with the climate thing, but we are unable to think how to act to this?
There's so many ways that we could enter into that question, but maybe I'll enter into the most provocative one, which is to say that, as you know, given your work, when we speak of attention economy, we're talking about a presupposition of an attention economy, right? So we're talking about neurotypicality. We're talking about the capacity to meet a given expectation of what it means to be captured. And so I'm not wanting to deny that I am changed by media economies. For sure, you catch me on a Facebook and I have trouble getting off it. You know, we all know that these forms of media do pull us into a kind of inertia, not super different from TV. You know, we've always found ways to be pulled into inertia, at least in my lifetime. But I think that sometimes the question is posed as though we had a general level of attention that we all expected was the most valuable form of attending, and I really question that. I've been lucky to I've been writing about neurodiversity now for quite a long time without realizing or thinking about or engaging with my own neurodiversity. I can't really explain why, except that I don't tend to think from that place. But I realized a few years ago that I have quite a bit of shame about what I would consider my bad attention span. I am very horizontal as a thinker. I think one thing, I move, I turn my head, I read something, I open a website, I close a website.
You read in bed.
I read in bed, and in that sense, I'm not the image of the scholar that one would have perhaps imagined would be the perfect scholar, like the kind who can sit with a book for 12 hours and forgets to eat. I never forget to eat. And yet, when I notice that, I think, but why am I feeling ashamed about it? I write books, I do things, like there doesn't seem to be a problem on the ground, right? Like I'm doing fine. But I have internalized that my way of attending to the world is wrong, right? And it's hard for me to explain to people that when I'm talking to them and checking something, I'm actually attending perfectly to them. That's just my way of attending. Mm-hmm. I do 2 or 3 things at the same time. Now, having worked for a long time on these issues, I understand. Look at that. You know, that's neurodiversity. But so I want to say that the first way to approach this question would be to question that. Now, the second way to approach this question is, of course, to talk about the way that our nervous systems have been totally captured and in ways that are palpable. Brian wrote a piece in the, now probably 15 years ago, right after 9/11, about called Fear the Spectrum said about the color spectrum that was brought into New York, or to, it was around New York after 9/11.
It was around the world.
It was around the world then, right? Where every day it was published what color the day was. Like if we were at a red level, an orange level, a yellow level. And Brian wrote about how the spectrum was tethered to the populace's nervous systems. That it wasn't so much that you felt in a certain way and then saw the world's spectrum, that the world's spectrum was feeling you into your day, that it was completely tethered in that way. So I think we're in this kind of double world where there's a capture on our attentions that is extremely dangerous and debilitating, that we live in a state, I think I can speak generally, of anxiety, where, and for good reason, the world is not a good place to be, I think. And when your body is anxious, it's a very, very reactive body. An anxious body is a body that is constantly catching whatever it is in the surround that can connect to the wound that is being opened in that very moment. So it's a very receptively closed body in a way. It's like it's a very particular kind of body, and I think we need to talk about that. But this is my last but. I think I've had like 5 buts now. But I do feel it's super, super dangerous to generalize. And I find that in the education system, it happens all the time. I hear my colleagues all the time talking about how the kids are lost, the kids aren't paying attention, the kids aren't coming to class, well, I'm teaching those kids, and they are coming to class, they're super curious, they're super creative, they're asking hard questions, and just to kind of make that felt, I asked them this week, I said to them, a lot of my colleagues are worried about AI. And I hear, I read a lot of things online from my colleagues saying, now I can't give essays anymore to the students because they're just using AI, blah, 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 blah. And I said to the students, but, I'm not so worried about AI. If you want to use AI, go ahead and use it, because I'm not actually interested in deciding how you learn. The students were really, really interesting. They made it clear that they're very conversant with AI. They were immediately kind of impatient, and they said to me, AI is not a person, it's just a bunch of data, and we create the data. So they had a really kind of down-to-earth way of thinking about it. A lot of the neurodiverse folks said that AI was very helpful for them to activate their thinking, to get them into a project, to get thinking about something. And they seem, to my mind, to be really smart about the limitations and the advantages of working in a wider media ecology that now included that as well. And I think so that it's important for us to learn from those people who are natively users of those technologies, which I'm not, they came late in my life or middle of my life, to understand from those people that they're actually extremely conversant in those technologies. They're very, very aware of the dangers of the technologies. They're very articulate about how they are captured by the technologies. Young children will tell you very openly about that, but they're also very smart about how to work with them, I think.
Yeah, I think when thinking about the issue of attention and the idea that our attention has been somehow destroyed, or it's been that we've lost our attention. Yeah. The first thing is to ask what kind of attention that implies we've lost. And what it implies is a kind of quiet concentration, like what we have in a classroom traditionally, toward the discourse of the teacher. And when people say we've lost the attention, what they're saying is that we're not following that logic as it's unspinning itself, and we're not basically interiorizing the norms of that logic. the attention we've lost was another form of capture. And there's a different regime of attention now, which also captures us, which has a different quality and a different temporality, and it's a kind of constant call to attention, but in a staccato way, with things calling themselves to our attention punctually for a brief moment, and then subsiding and coming again from link to link or from ting to ping on your phone. And there's just a series of discontinuous impingements, and that does distract you from that form of attention that's attached to basically master discourses and to methods of normalization through schooling. And in that other attention economy, distraction was the first and most available form of resistance. Right? And now now it's more that distraction has been captured than the attention has been captured. But it always seeps around the edges, because in between those staccato impingements, something else rises, something catches your attention sideways. You go back to what you were doing before. It might be colored a bit by what happened in between. You're operating in a fairly complex attentional field, which has different layers of temporality that are different from what we think of as the attention, the temporality the attention we lost had. And in those impingements, in what I think we all experience now as an environment that is basically an environment of threat. That's what those color alert systems were about. It trained us to think of the environment as a threat environment, which is one of the big military terms of that period. That there's also a completely different duration and temporality in what that's impinging upon. And our sideways moves of intention are also complemented by sort of moves to liminal or threshold levels of attention, where our daydreams, the flow of our inner monologue, the sort of waves of affective changes and moods that we undergo every day, that there's a kind of continuity that those impingements are hitting into, that can be a source of resistance to the fear and the anxiety, but more often than not, the fear and anxiety, it's a way that the fear and anxiety folds into your body, and starts to, in a sense, format you. Like I use concepts of priming, sort of posturing you in certain ways toward the world that can develop into affective regimes that can be extremely reactionary. But that, I think that sort of continuity of attention distracting itself toward processes that are underway on another level is also where a lot of power and powers of resistance can be found.
Yeah, I love the way you frame the problem and the question, really, because actually I don't like when the critique is really like nostalgic about the attention capacity and I love that you were saying in a certain way that we have another kind of attentional regime actually, but when critique sometimes try to address the problem,
Yeah.
Sometimes they link it attentional, the functioning of attention today with addiction. And this is actually a kind of a theory of the brain and a theory of attention. And I think maybe, I don't know, and this is, I would love to hear what you think about it, but this kind of link between attention and addiction is something that actually doesn't allow people to actually break with the thing that they actually feeling that is not okay with it. And after before I finish the question, I will love to add that when I was doing my research about attentional capacities of ADHD level people or ADHD people, just it depends on how they call themselves, but one thing that actually really I think what's important was the expectation about their own attention that they have, you know? And because when you were saying that, Erin, I felt the same, because people sometimes they felt that they must be inside, in front of the screen like 12 hours or 8 hours without, lost the attention. And these two things, the expectation about our attention capacities or our affective capacities, and the critical discourse about attention as a kind of addiction, I think is maybe not working towards something more like liberation or an emancipatory discourse.
Yeah. I remember what I was trying to get to at the end before I stopped, answering the last question, which is the idea that when your attention is captured, something different is going on. Attention is always captured. It's a complete myth that we actively pay attention as a subject toward the world. Attention is what grabs us, and there's studies that show that there are sort of subthreshold chaos of different vectors of attention that play out before we have the sense of deciding to pay attention to something, that we're always immersed in this kind of process where attention is an emergent property of a lot of processes going on in different ways. Now I've forgotten what the rest of the question was.
Shall I go?
Yes.
So addiction was the question.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you want to say something first, or I?
Yeah, I think addiction, that model doesn't take into account the interpolation that we're subjected to, that we're immersed in an environment where we're constantly being impinged upon and interpolated, and it's a question of a collective machinery before it's a question of addiction and of personal capacities.
Yeah, so before I come to the question of addiction, which is something I've thought a lot about, I want to say something about ADHD. Without going the pathological route, because it's not the route that's interesting to me, but still sort of taking into account that as the most documented pathology in the learning environment, it is clearly conceived or thought of as an impingement to learning, right? So we wouldn't know as much as we do about ADHD if it weren't a problem, or if it weren't considered by the people who have, so to speak, to get in the way of their proper attention, right? I mean, the reason people are getting diagnosed is that they don't feel like they can do the work the way they've been asked to do it. And they've destroyed their confidence through that process. So that made me think of jazz. And I was thinking about, nobody says, oh my God, you went to a concert and you couldn't attend, right? So what is a concert doing? But I was thinking of jazz in particular because of the call and response. And I was thinking about how, what music does is it allows you to go to be in more than one vector of attention, one could say. There are periods of daydream, there are periods of return. There's no great anxiety that if you lost 5 bars, you're behind, because it has a kind of rhythm of return. Similar with sitting around a table, having a conversation, you can zone in and out of that conversation. So clearly, when we speak of attention, we're talking about catching everything, right? So we're back into really normative ideas of communication, or, transmission of communication. One of the things that I've noticed working with a lot of neurodiverse folks is that if they have to articulate where their weakness, so to speak, is, I'm not buying this pathological vocabulary, but just saying it that way, they speak of their memory. This is the most common thing. So people will say, I have problems with my memory. It's really interesting, and I hear it all the time. And what they mean by that is really interesting, though I don't think they know necessarily that what they mean by that is really interesting. And what I think they're saying to me is, Erin, I couldn't remember what the general project was, so I had to create it again. And truly, this is the kind of work I see a lot, is people who give me the same, they're writing a PhD with me and they're giving me the same project every time they come back to it. Right, so they have lives, they have kids, they have jobs, so they'll write for a certain period of time, then they'll leave, and then they'll start again at the beginning, and they'll start again at the beginning, and they'll start again at the beginning. Now, the academic edifice doesn't respect this. You're not supposed to start again at the beginning 200 times. You're supposed to get to the end of it. But getting to the end of it suggests that you have to be able to create a kind of distance to your work so that you can see it from a distance as a whole, and then move in that whole. But I think one of the specificities about ADHD, at least in the way that I'm often encountering it, is that whole doesn't exist. And so I find as a teacher that I have to have totally new techniques for engaging. And part of that is becoming the memory of the project, for example. And becoming curious about what the memory of that project is. And it's very common for me, because I don't think I have ADHD, to be able to say to somebody, look, this is where we were. This is the question you had. Let's get back to that question. Because it would be better to not have a 20-year PhD just for your bank account and your mental health or whatever, So that leads me then to the question of addiction. There's a real challenge with the question of pathology. It's a challenge that I feel very, very strongly. So a lot of people who work with me have, at a certain point in our trajectory, become diagnosed. And the diagnosis is a terrible thing. I mean, really, it's always a violent thing. But the diagnosis becomes important either because they have children who are autistic or who are really struggling and they're trying to make sense of their own difference in relation to that, or because they need some access tools, they need some support, or because they've been so shamed by their difference that they just need to make sense of it. But in the diagnosis, often what happens is that they harden around the diagnostic realm. So they become the pathology that they were pathologized into. And and of course one understands how that can happen. That you hold on to something that describes you, and then you become what you've been described as, and then you can become also you can begin to write a script of your incapacities, and this is something that I see a lot. So I can't, a student who comes to me and says, I can't write because I can't pay attention because I have ADHD, for example. That's a quite common thing in the undergrads, and what I try to do with them is to simply show them that there's more than one kind of attention, right? And so there's other ways, and not like to shame them that they have to be in this one way, but like what other ways are there? So coming to the question of addiction, so I'm an addict. I'm a recovering addict, but I've been in recovery over 30 years. But like most addicts that I know I'm an addict. Which is to say that I don't take for granted my recovery, and I recognize that there are tendencies in me that are extremely quick to mobilize in that kind of rhythm that could be extremely dangerous for me. But the addiction part of me, or the addict Erin, is also a really joyful person who can get very, very enthusiastic and intense about things. I don't think it's an altogether bad thing. But it took me a pretty long time to think that way. And I don't mean by that to say that I'm in any way, I just never underestimate, the danger of drug and alcohol addiction in relation to my being. So what I've noticed over my life is that some people aren't addicts. I really have noticed that. Like, it's totally shocking to me. Like, you know, I'll see people who take drugs and drink and they're not addicts, and I cannot understand. You know, and so I know that we have to be really careful when we move with that vocabulary of the addict, because it really is a particular kind of a production of subjectivity. And in order to not pathologize that either, we have to, because if you pathologize it, you can't be in recovery, I think. I think that the capacity for shame in that environment is so big because of the neurotypicality of our environment that tells you that you're weak in relation to the world. That because the recovery from addiction is all based on some kind of normative idea of self-control, which imposes such a strong edifice of moral righteousness. So in order not to do that, I think we have to be more pliable with the vocabulary. And the question we have to ask is a more complex one about what the conditions for detouring are. So, you know, there can be problems with Alcoholics Anonymous. It certainly saved my life. But the core of Alcoholics Anonymous has to do with becoming so embodied by your addiction that there is no other body except the addicted body. You know, to the way that they say it is to do the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And that is a particular black hole. And so I think I would prefer to go back to the question of how can we be collectively, in a kind of really transindividual sense that is beyond the human to human, how can we collectively be engaged in techniques that allow for detours, that are not shaming the capture?
And I think maybe one way of thinking about attention that builds in the idea of detours is thinking about it in terms, you mentioned in relation to politics earlier, different kinds of durations. But every duration is also a kind of economy, not in the narrow sense, but in the sense of a regime, more in the French meaning of the word, as rates of flow and changes of direction and revectorings. And it seems to me that that attention is not an act that a subject does. It's a kind of duration that a body is immersed into or it's made to cut away from. And in our practices, we do have practices of very sustained attention. When we read books, we do really close readings collectively, where the attention of a room full of people is sometimes on a single paragraph for an hour. But there's a kind of immersion that isn't sort of a directed connection to something, but it's a moving into a flow. And in those groups, when you start paying attention to a text at that level, there's ideas pop up, people relay each other, there are detours, the detours come back around. There's a very complex economy of attention that isn't just us directing ourselves to the official meaning of the text. So I think that there can be modes of attention that have different combinations of flow and interruption in the way that sort of when you're quiet and if you have that kind of sustained attention where you read a book for hours on end, afterwards you realize that half the time you were daydreaming and you were cutting in and out and that things were cutting in on your reading. And it's a very creative thing because it actually creates these synergies that enrich the reading. Or it's more of an experience of being immersed in music than it is being a subject that's nailed to a particular to a particular point that you have to be taking into account.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And I think this can actually give us the opportunity to pass to the last question, but also to somehow to recall some things that we were talking before, because these spaces or these practices that allows us to create the tours or to be immersed in different regimes on different attention economies that actually make us creative or able to sustain our lives in a way that is not the I don't know, capitalistic or fascist way. It's really linked to what you were doing, like in Sense Lab, but also in Tree Ecologies right now. And I would like to, just for finishing this interview, if you can tell us more about the Tree Ecologies project and how it is connected to, and how actually this project differs from what you were doing with Sense Lab. And I think this is actually something that in our experience in Chile, this opportunity to create other spaces, alter spaces and alter economies or alter way of living is really like important and happening right now with different projects that as Tierra in Vitrina Dystópica. So I would love to hear more about it.
The Sense Lab and Three Ecologies have worked between philosophy and art or creative making in a relational way, setting up conditions for encounter on the assumption that the abstract is imbricated in the concrete and vice versa, and that the embodied interactions that can come with creative making or other forms of live interaction are no less abstract than the ideas in the books, because they're enacting modes of relation and they're bringing out potentials, and both relations and potentials sort of exceed the particular empirical terms in play. So we try to follow Deleuze's precept that concepts have to be lived, and that philosophy is a creative activity, but also reverse the flow and saying that forms of group interaction and forms of creative play together have philosophical implications that can be brought out on a conceptual level. What's changed is that of Guattari's three ecologies, which were the social, the mental / subjective, and the environmental, in the Sense Lab we really work between the social and the conceptual. And 3E adds a land-based element that very directly addresses the environmental ecology. And the idea is that all three constitute an enlarged ecology, and you can't address one without also having to address the others, and that each is a point of entry into the other, so that we try to create that field of experimentation where we're busy every day on the land, land regeneration, exploring the land, learning about the forest, but at the same time we're doing that imbued with a sense of the thinking that Erin was talking about before, that traverses the everyday.
Yeah, I think that what brings the two together is a commitment to a kind of structured improvisation. That we have, we developed with Sense Lab a concept of enabling constraints many years ago. We can often talk about what we do in sort of smart ways in retrospect, but I think it's important to understand how lost we are in the moments of trying to do it. So when I started Sense Lab in 2003, Brian got involved very, very soon afterwards. The question that I entered with was, how can collaboration become a lived experience in a way that didn't feed into the modalities of capture for collaboration in institutions? It was an intuition, and it had to do with my fear of being captured by the university. I was beginning an academic job, and I knew that the university had a market interest in interdisciplinarity. But that would also be the end of my curiosity if I had to live there. So it started literally by asking people, are you interested in exploring new forms of collaboration? And that's how it began. And then it grew out of how it grew. Over 17 or 18 years, we didn't advertise, we learned as we learned. And the beauty of Sense Lab was that the stakes were relatively low. We weren't trying to, run a nation state. We were working in the first decade or so interstitially, borrowing spaces, reading books, organizing events, learning from each other, developing collaborations. Eventually we had our own space at Concordia. We got a grant, but we waited 10 years before seeking funding. So we taught each other to be slow and curious, I think. 3E is less slow because its stakes are different. But I think it's important to say that it didn't start at all where it is now. When it started as a movement of thought, we imagined something akin to an alter university or a think tank. We talked about it in both those ways. In the beginning, we talked about it as a Three Ecologies Institute. We talked about what it might be to grow an environment of learning that would welcome those modes of learning that were excluded by the university. But we did talk about it at that point in a way that you could imagine there could have been a seminar or a gathering around a text or something like that. We dreamed about having a church in Montreal where we would have pulley systems to really challenge architectures. We had lots of dreams, but we didn't have the money for the dreams. But part of the way that our work has always happened is that we've dreamed our way into an activity or into a mode. When it happened that the land came to us, as some people know, it wasn't planned. We hadn't given a lot of thought, or any thought actually, to doing it that way. But once the land came, the land became its own movement of thought, and it became clear very quickly that it was going to be really important for us to extend the work on alter economies we'd been doing by then for a couple of decades to ask how to give the land back to itself. So it very quickly became a project thinking very hard about property and property relations, but that question didn't come out of the blue. It was just one of the sort of the emergent questions in the surround that then got mobilized by the way that the project began to unfold. And as the project has unfolded, as we move toward a fifth year, every year is changing with the people who are attracted to it, the questions that they're asking, the way in which Brian and I are learning. In the first couple of years, I think Brian and I both wondered whether we'd ever write again. It was so much physical labor, and we were anxious and learning things and feeling overwhelmed and scared often, and it's a big financial responsibility, to very, very complicated to have a solar site in the north. So there isn't, I think it would be important to not imagine that Brian and I are in front of our project. We're like running behind them trying to understand what they're doing. But that's also our temperaments, that's where we're curious. I think we're not people who want to reproduce ourselves. We're not interested in being at the center. of our projects are really interested in being part of an emergent collectivity of thought and to learn how to do that.
Yeah, I think that notion that we mentioned before of emergent collectivity is a line of continuity. In my work, I work a lot with a concept that I call surplus value of life, and that's related to emergent collectivity. It's the idea that in relation that the parts or people, entities, whatever they are, in relation are the activity of each starts to modulate the activity of the other. So at a certain point when things start moving together, you can't say where the action is coming from one particular point or another, because it's happening really integrally in between. And when that happens, it throws off a certain kind of affective intensity, a certain kind of affective tonality, and there's a sense of liveliness that I call surplus value of life. So that's the emergent quality of relation that marks an emergent collectivity, and that's what we've always sought after. And since that created a lot of techniques for trying to create what we call platforms for relation that set the conditions in place for that to start happening. But again, it's not something you can do. Like Erin's concept of the minor gesture, you don't do it, you lend yourself to it, or it calls you. So we've always thought very hard about how to make collective endeavors truly self-organizing without executive committees, without decision making. That's changed a bit with the three ecologies, because we have to have a non-profit, and then we have to create forms of what we call creative duplicity of how to meet the legal requirements of a non-profit while safeguarding through that or on the side of that or around that the self-organizing collective process. So that's a lot of what we think about is how we negotiate those different strata that are necessarily involved in the activity. So where we are at 3E is quite remote. It's a wild tract of forest. It's completely off-grid, so we depend on solar panels. And in a place where there's 2 meters of snow each year, that's not an easy proposition, where 2 nights ago it went down to minus 44. It's very harsh conditions. So whereas with Sense Lab we had a kind of open field where we could implant the conditions, enabling constraints to create the conditions we wanted. Here we're always in the conditions that the forest and the climate are creating for us. And so that's raised a slightly different question, where we created a domain of creative play where it wasn't anything goes, it wasn't unconstrained, but we could model the constraints to help these kinds of emergent collectivities and catalyzing of relation happen. Here we're responding to the constraints of the land, and it feels an awful lot like work. So one of the big questions is, how do we find that sense of play or margin of play, even in hard labor on the land? And our goal is to take the land out of private ownership, permanently out of the real estate market, and create not a community, because communities are in their own way privative, they're exclusive, but an open platform that is invitational, where people can come together to explore experimental radical pedagogy and learn about environmental sustainability, working to help regenerate a forest at the same time.
And I think I would just end by saying that it's important to know that this isn't a back to the land project. We are always in the land. We're sitting on it right now in the city in Montreal. It's maybe goes back to the question of attention. You know, in the city, your attention is mobilized differently than in the forest, and I think it's worth thinking about those differences because they're important. They're also important for neurodiversity. I mean, I've noticed how healthy the forest is for neurodiversity because it catches attention in more than one register, and that can often calm a body down. But I think it's really, really important that we don't begin to idealize the land as though, and then produce another kind of culture-nature schism, right? So it is about learning that property is not a given. We really do. I think those of us who grew up in, all of us, I guess, grew up in capitalism, we've somehow accepted property as a given, and ownership of property as a given, and it takes practice to unthink that. I mean, we are now on the verge of tending lands that are not our property, right? So we're actively giving those lands away, but that doesn't change how we tend them and how they tend us. And the hope is that in that process, it becomes a kind of site of practice for philosophical work, for gardening, for forest maintenance, for making maple syrup, for all of those things, that is not in a kind of dichotomy to the urban, that is simply another site of experimentation of the urban or with the urban, so that we, over time, when we are in the urban, that we don't lose that third ecology. Because I think when Guattari said that, you know, in the 1980s, that we had to think transversely across the three ecologies, he was incredibly prescient. Like, he really understood that we weren't going to be able to get to the environment if we didn't understand that it was a transversality with the conceptual and the social. And that's our challenge in these times, to hold a transversal logic, which is not the kind of logic that is given to us in the everyday.
And that transversality extends to the relationship between the country and the city, that it's a regime of passage back and forth, and a transductive relation rather than a dichotomy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Really appreciate your answers. Really great. Just a little bit for finishing, because it's so difficult to us, I mean, people growing in capitalism, to think these kind of things. You know, when you were saying, like, to try to take the land off the property of the land market. I don't understand how you can do this. I mean, because this is something, but it's also related to another thing that you were working on several years. That is the concept of value also, and I think, just for finish, just some words about this process to take the land out of the market, and what is how it is related to a new concept or a different concept of value.
Well, there are legal forms that are based on the notion of a trust. There are land trusts where the land is in a sense owned by an idea, because there's a governing mission that has to be followed forever. So if you say that the land is set aside for experimental pedagogy and environmental sustainability, and it's in something like a land trust, there's no way of undoing that. It's something that's locked in. If it's locked in to itself and out of the market, officially it has no value. It can't be taxed because the value is based on the potential real estate value. So what we want to do is try to have that kind of legal status, but as one part of a more expanded arrangement where there are different forms of experimentation, different forms of engagement happening, that it's not defined by that legal status, but the legal status is an enablement for other things to happen.
Yeah, I learned a lot through Black studies around this question, and I'm sure, you know, and to another degree from Indigenous studies, but I'm most familiar with Black studies around the question of property. And I think that alongside what Brian said, this question of the idea is really key. It isn't just taking the land legally out of the property market, out of the real estate market. It is practicing another way of thinking about property that, again, we have access to. So I think, for example, about the ubiquity of private property in rich middle class and upper class environments, where you assume, for example, here we are sitting in an apartment in Montreal, that people own or have access to an apartment that has a door, that has a keyed entry, that belongs to people who claim it and have a claim on it. We know that the people who own it have a stronger claim on it than the people who rent it, because the people who rent it are in danger of losing it by the people who own it. So we know something about ownership, and we at least here, I mean, I'm speaking as a Canadian, we grow into our belief of the arc of our lives as an ownership arc. So we understand our ways of being of value in the world in relation to ownership. Now, there are people, and here, I'm thinking of more poor people for whom the house has only ever been a site of passage. You think of those houses, and often they are in the south because of also the weather, but you think of those houses that are literally sites of passage, where kids are moving and running in and out, where the dinner is set and there are different kids at the table every night, because there isn't this kind of strong in, locked out ethos. Often that happens when people don't have access to property ownership, because that's not because they just don't have the finances for it. They're already devalued in relation to that modality, but they have the surplus value of life, of the environment in its mobility. So it's not that we don't have examples in the world of what we're trying to do, because that would be an example of it, right? But the problem is that it seems to me that this accretional idea of growing up into ownership is so powerful that when I meet people and they don't begin to move toward that direction, they feel they failed, right? So like, people will have student apartments and feel cool about it, but when they turn 40, it becomes a concern, right? Now I need my real estate. And so I think we collectively need to help each other unthink that idea. In order to do that, we obviously need income, right? So like, this isn't a project that can work if you're not managing to eat, or if you don't have nowhere to live, right? So it can't occur outside of an ecology of practices that supports life and gives life, But I do think that in this ethos of or the morality of private property, we have become unbelievably selfish and individualistic about space. We don't bend over to pick up the cup on the neighbor's lawn, right? Because we don't think it's our cup. It's not mine to pick up. I don't have to clean the street. That somebody else cleans the street. I only have to take care of the place that I've made an investment in. And if we think like that, it's over. There's no capacity for ecological care, right? We have to want to tend to the commons, I think.
The paradox of the project is that we can only give the land back to itself because we have a privileged position in relationship to the capitalist property system. We were able to buy the land because we had an inheritance from a parent. When I said that the land has no value in a trust, it has no capitalist value, market value that can be attached to it. That creates a bit of a clean slate in order to revalue it. And we want to revalue it in the direction of a gift economy, where we, at least in that portion of our activities in our lives, we divest ourselves of a certain amount of property in order to entrust it to an alternative economy that will have collective bases.
Yeah, and I think what it does is it makes you think really hard about investment. It touches terrible fears about longevity, about survival, about needs. It puts you in a relationship that is terrifying, because we don't live in cultures here that care much about aging and all of that are extremely ableist, and are not set up to support bodies that need support over time. So it is a little bit like jumping off a cliff, but it's invigorating to have a cliff still to jump off.
Speaking again of durations, it puts us in an intergenerational duration. I mean, it was generational wealth that made it possible.
Yeah.
Thinking about creating a platform for relation in perpetuity that's permanent, that never ends, is thinking past our own lives and toward future generations. And I think that's been a very important part of it as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I keep going like 2 hours more, but
yeah, you're gonna have a lot to edit.
yeah. So just for finish the record, I mean, really, thank you very much. We are really happy to have this conversation with you in the collective and with the group that we are trying to create, Tierra, and the other groups that we are trying to set up over there in Chile. And I would like to invite you to have a discussion also with the collective in Tierra, because I think there is a lot of things that we can share about these problems, and we'd love to do it with you.
With pleasure. Thank you so much for such great questions.
Thank you. And this was otro capítulo de Vitrina Distópica, la realidad no es capitalista.